dear students. In this particular video we are going to do the text of the short story titled as Hearts and Hands, which is written by William Sidney Porter, who is very popularly known as O. Henry. In the last class I had given you a brief introduction to the story. Also, I explained you about the author and we did the outline to the story. So here we continue with the text of the story. So Hearts and Hands by O. Henry. At Denver, there was an influx of passengers into the coaches on the eastbound B&M Express. In one coach, there sat a very pretty young woman, dressed in elegant taste and surrounded by all the luxurious comforts of an experienced traveler. Among the newcomers were two young men, one of handsome presence with a bold, frank countenance and manner, the other a ruffled, glum-faced person, heavily built and roughly dressed. The two were handcuffed together. Now, this particular story, Hearts and Hands, is set on a train, and the name of that train is B&M Express, and this was traveling to the east. It was a east-bound train. The entire action of the story is confined to one of the coaches in the train, where a young, beautiful and elegantly dressed woman, Miss Fairchild, is sitting. It is at Denver. This is the name of the station. So it is at Denver station that two other men, two young men, they enter or board the train. One of them is an old friend of Miss Fairchild, and his name is Mr. Easton, and he is the man who is of handsome presence or appearance. So in other words, we can say that he is a very handsome young man, whereas the other man, who is very rough, fat and glum-faced person, is the marshal. So throughout the story, the passengers have a light conversation. Thus, the story depicts a casual and unassuming atmosphere. Now, when the train stopped at Denver, there was an influx of passengers. Influx of passengers means a large number of people entered into the train. Okay. And this train was traveling to the east, that is B&M Express. And in one of the coaches of the train, there was sitting a very pretty young woman who was very elegantly and beautifully dressed, and she was surrounded by all the luxurious comforts. Luxurious comforts means it appeared that she was a very experienced traveler. She was very comfortable and she was carrying expensive things with her. Okay, so she was experienced of traveling. And when the train, this particular lady is Miss Fairchild. When the train stopped at Denver station, many people boarded the train, and among these people there were two young men. And in the beginning we are just told about their appearance. One of these men was of very handsome appearance. He had a very bold and very frank appearance, countenance. Countenance means appearance. His manners were also very bold and frank. Whereas the other person, he appeared to be very ruffled. Ruffled means he had a very upset looking face. He was gloomy face. Glum face means gloomy face person. He was heavily built and very roughly dressed. So he was upset, gloomy faced, fat, and roughly dressed. And what was interesting to notice is that these two men were handcuffed together. They were handcuffed. They were handcuffed means they were chained. You know, when a criminal is arrested, the police handcuffs that criminal. So a handcuff is a metal fastening that can be locked around a wrist and is usually connected by a chain or bar with another such fastening. So these two people were chained together. Okay. As they passed down the aisle of the coach, the only vacant seat offered was a reserved one facing the attractive young woman. Here the linked couple seated themselves. The young woman's glance fell upon them with a distant, swift disinterest. Then, with a lovely smile brightening her countenance and a tender pink tinging her rounded cheeks, she held out a little grey gloved hand. When she spoke, her voice, full, sweet, and deliberate, proclaimed that its owner was accustomed to speak and be heard. So when these two people, that is one handsome person, the other one a glum-faced person, ruffled person, when these two people boarded the train at Denver station and they passed down the aisle of the coach. Aisle means a passage between the seats. Okay, so the passage between the seats is called the aisle. So when they passed down the aisle of the coach, they found that the only vacant seat available in that coach was the seat which was facing opposite to that attractive young woman, that is Miss Fairchild. So they seated down themselves at that particular seat. So they were sitting just opposite to Miss Fairchild. Now when the young woman, when Miss Fairchild, she looked at this man, she initial look was that she was distant and she had no interest. So with a glance of swift disinterest, she saw at both of them, and then suddenly there appeared a lovely smile on her face, which brightened her appearance, and a tender pink tinging. Tinging means there was the color of her cheeks changed. Okay. Why? Because she could identify that one of these men was her old friend, Mr. Easton. So when she saw Mr. Easton in that coach, she her she had a lovely smile on her face. And why lovely smile? Because a person really enjoys the company of one of his old friends in a journey, and particularly when that old friend comes into the train unexpectedly, that gives some sort of pleasure. So Miss Fairchild also had a lovely smile on her face, her appearance changed, and the color of her cheeks also changed, and she extended her grey gloved hand, the hand covered with the grey colored gloves, in order to greet Mr. Easton. And when she spoke, her voice was full, sweet, deliberate, and it appeared as if her voice declared that she was used to speak and be heard. Okay. And well, Mr. Easton, if you will make me speak first, I suppose I must. So she was the one who broke the silence, and she was the one who first approached to Mr. Easton on that particular train. What did Miss Fairchild say to begin the conversation? She said, "Well, Mr. Easton, if you will make me speak first, I suppose I must." So she says that if Mr. Easton wants her to speak first, then she will not hesitate to speak first. So don't you ever recognize old friends when you meet them in the West? So she asked Mr. Easton that, "Are you not recognizing me? I am one of your old friends, and don't you ever recognize your old friend when you meet that friend in the West?" The young man roused himself sharply at the sound of her voice. Roused himself sharply means the young man got excited because he never expected to find Miss Fairchild on the train. So roused himself means to get excited. So the young man also got very excited at the voice of Miss Fairchild, and it appeared as if the young man was struggling little embarrassment. He was feeling little awkward, though we are not given the reason that why was he feeling awkward at that particular moment. So he felt a little embarrassed, feeling of little awkwardness. However, he threw off that embarrassment instantly, and then he clasped her fingers with his left hand. He held, clasp means to held tightly. He held the fingers of Miss Fairchild tightly as a sign of greeting, and he did this with his left hand. Now, here we need to understand that this particular story, Hearts and Hands, is full of irony. Now, there are different kinds of irony used in this particular story. One is situational irony, verbal irony, and a dramatic irony. Situational irony happens when a contrast is there between what is expected to occur and what actually happens. At the very beginning of this story, we see that there is a mismatch between the appearance of the two men who enter into the train, and the mismatch between their appearance, and there is also mismatch in the reality, which is only revealed at the end of the story. One of these two men is very handsome looking person, and he appeared to be the marshal, to be the police officer, whereas the other man, who appeared to be very fat, rough, and glum-faced, he seemed to be the prisoner. But at the end of the story, we get to know that in reality, the handsome looking man, that is Mr. Easton, was a counterfeiter, was a criminal, whereas the other man, that is the fat, ruffled, gloomy faced man, he was the marshal. So this is an example of situational irony. So we saw that when Mr. Easton heard the voice of Miss Fairchild, he got excited, and he appeared to be struggling with a sense of embarrassment. However, he threw off that sense of embarrassment and held the finger of Miss Fairchild as a sign of greeting. Now, "It's Miss Fairchild," he said with a smile. "I will ask you to excuse the other hand. It is otherwise engaged at present." So he raised his other hand. He at once recognized Miss Fairchild and says, "It's Miss Fairchild." And he begged Miss Fairchild to excuse his other hand. You remember, he extended his left hand, not the right hand. So that may be taken as a sign of misconduct, or a sign of not good manners. So therefore he begged Miss Fairchild to excuse his other hand, because the other hand was engaged at that particular moment. And in order to show how his other hand was engaged, he slightly raised his right hand. which was bound at the wrist by the signing bracelet to the left one of his companion. Okay, so it was bound by the handcuff to the left hand of his companion, that is the rough and the gloomy faced man. Now, the moment Miss Fairchild saw that Mr. Easton was handcuffed with another person, the glad look in her eyes slowly changed into a bewildered horror. Okay, she was puzzled, she was confused, unable to make out that why is he handcuffed. The glow faded from her cheeks. Her lips parted in a vague, relaxing distress. She was feeling very worried. Easton, with a little laugh, as if amused, was about to speak again when the other forestalled him. So Mr. Easton was about to speak, was about to explain Miss Fairchild the situation or why was he handcuffed. It is at that particular moment that the other person, that is the gloomy faced man, he forestalled Mr. Easton. Forestalled means he acted before Mr. Easton could say anything. And he interrupted and he started speaking to the elegantly dressed woman. The glum faced man had been watching the girl's countenance with veiled glances with indirect looks, because he did not know Miss Fairchild, but he was looking at the appearance of Miss Fairchild through hidden looks. So he could see how she had become glad in the initial time, and now when she saw that they are handcuffed, the appearance of her face changed. So he was observing that. So therefore, he felt that he must intervene in order to save Mr. Easton from that embarrassment and from that awkward situation. So therefore, he says to the lady, "You will excuse me for speaking, Miss, but I see you are acquainted with the marshal here. If you will ask him to speak a word for me when we get to the pen, he will do it. And it will make things easier for me there. He is taking me to Leavenworth prison. It is 7 years for counterfeiting." So he informs Miss Easton that Mr. Easton is not speaking frankly with her because he is performing his duty. And he can speak only when he has taken the gloomy faced man to the prison. Pen means here prison. And once he goes to the prison, then things would become easier for Mr. Easton. He also informs Miss Fairchild that Mr. Easton is a marshal and he is taking me to the Leavenworth prison. So Easton was taking that man to the Leavenworth prison. It is 7 years for counterfeiting. Okay, it seems the gloomy man introduced himself as a counterfeiter, a person who has been charged for imitating in order to deceive others, or who has dealt with fake currencies. And for deceiving others, he has been sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment, and therefore he is being taken to Leavenworth prison. And Mr. Easton is the marshal who has been given the responsibility of taking that criminal to the Leavenworth prison. So since he was performing his duty, therefore he was not feeling free or bold to talk with Miss Fairchild. So once his duty is performed, then he can easily talk with Miss Fairchild. So you see, in order to save Mr. Easton from that embarrassment, this gloomy faced man, who was actually the marshal, introduces himself as the prisoner, whereas he introduces Mr. Easton as the marshal, as the police officer. So there is verbal irony. What do we mean by verbal irony? Verbal irony happens when the character says one thing and its meaning is entirely different. Like, for example, you see here, the gloomy faced man told Miss Fairchild, "He is taking me to live in birth prison. It is 7 years for counterfeiting." So, in this sentence, the gloomy faced man wants Miss Fairchild to assume that he has got a 7 year sentence for counterfeiting, when actually it is the handsome young man, Mr. Easton, who is the counterfeiter and who is being taken to the prison. However, Miss Fairchild assumes what is told by the gloomy faced man, and she says, "Oh," said the girl with a deep breath and returning color. "So that is what you are doing out here, a marshal." Okay. So she is at once glad to know that Mr. Easton has become a marshal. "My dear Miss Fairchild," said Easton calmly, "I had to do something. Money has a way of taking wings unto itself. Taking wings unto itself means multiplying itself. Money grows fast. And you know, it takes money to keep step with our crowd in Washington. To keep step with our crowd in Washington means to compete with the people who are usually rich in Washington." And Mr. Easton informs that he saw this opportunity in the West, and well, a marshalship isn't quite as high a position as that of an ambassador. So here you see, here Mr. Easton says that he had to do something. Now this also is an example of verbal irony. Here Mr. Easton knows that he is telling that he did not want Miss Fairchild to understand that what he was doing truly. So he knows he had a ambition of making money fast, and in order to make that money fast, he became a counterfeiter. But he did not want Miss Fairchild to know the reality, know the truth. So therefore he says, "I had to do something." So he became a marshal. So he became a marshal. And he says that he found this opportunity in the West, and becoming a marshal is not that good as that of an ambassador. Why? He speaks of the ambassador because Miss Fairchild had a passing affair with the ambassador in the earlier days when Miss Fairchild knew Mr. Easton. Okay. So we do till here in this video. In the next video we'll continue from here.